work with Indigenous co-authors in the book, and thinking about the kind of perceptual differences that we ourselves as authors are kind of carrying through the work. And I think you talked about negotiation. And for me, when I think about negotiation, I'm also thinking about kind of conversation and the building of a kind of trust and sharing of knowledge and lived experience that goes into these works. And Lara mentioned her own work, stretching back into the past decade. And I think one of the things that have characterized this book is that it's taken us a long time to write. And it's partly taken us a long time to write because of COVID. There was a large pause in the end when we were all locked down, and I don't know about you, but my brain did not work during a portion of time. But it has also taken a long time because we felt as though we needed to follow through conversations. We needed to stay with people. We needed to try and learn about, okay, what is your perception of this thing, and how is our perception different from that, and how do we actually start to include some of this complexity in the work. And during the theory of the book as well, we're also trying to think about more than human perception. What does it mean for a tree to perceive time? What does it mean for mycorrhizal fungi to be relating to us? Is there a relation? What is there? How do we think these through? So I think there's a sense of negotiation we've felt in this book, not only between the human actors, but also to our non-human actors as well. I'm not sure how well we've done with this, but we certainly raise it all the time, repeatedly, and we've tried to kind of think against these things and think with them. Thank you for the question.
I might add to it. I'm not sure if this is answering your question, and I'd love to hear the specifics of what you work with in your own practice. But one of the things in terms of thinking about different ways of interpreting performance and different perspectives, one of the things I've written about is the very large puppet, Amal, do you know the little Amal, who's like a five metre puppet, and she walked from Turkey as a kind of protest piece for standing for refugees, but also for climate justice, right, and she walked through, I can't remember, 32 countries, something like that, all the way to COP, which was in Ireland, I think, or Scotland. I can't remember which COP. I can't remember where she ended up, but it was days and days. And I think she's a really interesting example of a non-speaking figure, a non-human figure, obviously in a human form of this little girl, but who could capture the different communities and bring them together to discuss whatever was pertinent to their particular region. She didn't speak, the whole point was that she didn't speak a particular language. She could cross those cultural borders, and she wasn't dictating anything, but she was bringing people together, particularly young people, to try and talk about what the problems were and how to resolve them. And that's such a, one of the beautiful, incredible powers of performance, to do that without forcing the conversation to be about what I'm interested in and what's important to me, right? She opened up that possibility for many different cultures and through many different languages. But yeah, thanks for your question. If you want to talk about your practice, I'd be interested to hear.
Thank you. I'm just adding into Subhash's comment. So when you speak about the audience, right, and when you talk about humans, and I think about how we understand these audiences also are different, how each of them responds. So when you talk about non-human actors, and we have the government, we have the corporations, and we have the people, right? So what are the best sort of ways to address corporations, especially given that, that is the biggest challenge that we've been facing in terms of climate justice. I know that they've been familiar with the work of Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, who use a lot of performance art in terms of resistance for through nonviolence disobedience. But something that I've noticed, especially in countries like Sri Lanka, when we talk about climate change as a problem, a lot of people feel guilty, especially the younger generation. So people think that we are responsible for it. So the tourists responses is either one is feeling guilty, so you stop caring or you look away from it, or you go down this road of despair. So what could be potential ways of challenging this, groups that should be held accountable without really pushing the youth towards this negative emotion?
It's the $1 million question. It's such a good question, and if I had the answer, I wouldn't be here. But I think I'll go back to this person, Max Liboiron, who talks about the importance of going to the tap, upstream to the tap, to turn off the tap upstream, and that's the corporations, right? That we don't. So one thing they talk about, because they work with a lot of First Nations communities and learning to respect their livelihoods, their ways of living, is not to say, well, you should all be vegetarians, right? Because you're depleting the oceans. It's like, no, those Indigenous communities can eat whales or they can eat fish. Actually, the problem is coming further upstream, and that's the thing that needs to be addressed. And so I think, of course, we have the same issue in Australia where young people become really despondent about, what's happening because they feel powerless to go upstream. But I think some people, like the Climate Guardians, really do try to attack at the top. And they are a really good model for the young people. And I think art is a way to maybe process some of those emotions of guilt, or understanding where blame should kind of come in through these kind of creative acts of doing, even if they're not kind of doing anything but kind of building a kind of consciousness and a collectivity. Especially young people in Australia are so atomized now with social media and the way that our world is working. So even that kind of importance of building something creative together in itself is like a very gentle act of resistance against that kind of corporate, uncaring. Yeah.
I think I'd also add that the last thing we would want to do is set ourselves up as experts as to how our Sri Lankan colleagues should respond to particular kind of contextual relations that you may have, and that that friends and artists here might be involved in. I think one of the ways I guess we gently suggest is that gatherings like this are very important, and actually sharing knowledge from artists, from activists here who are already doing the work that I'm sure we know less about, would actually be a really wonderful starting point and a really wonderful way of kind of continuing that sharing of ideas and sharing of resources.
General question about performance art, so what you described is really touching the First Nations or Australian art, but it's very emotional as well. I can connect with it because I work in climate change and sustainability is my research field. I just want to find out, as performance artists, you guys, you pinpoint to the issue very well, but can performance art in general lead to solutions? That's number one question. The second one is...
That's a big question.
I know.
What is we'll go to another.
I just asked the other one also. It's sort of connected because I know you guys have come from Australia. I don't know what's the objective or the audience of your books, or this book that you were talking about. as some researcher in the climate change field, I've come across many talks. People come from, as you mentioned, the climate justice is a very big issue, and it's Sri Lanka has to take a role on climate justice. So I've come across many people from the north come and tell us about what climate change and all these things, especially about mitigation. Sometimes, especially in American, come and tell us we should mitigate, and it's a big problem because it should be the case. So I just want to ask, what's your actual objective in this book, going into the world? Is it to? I love that. But what you shared is I can connect with it. Because I go through data, and when I see it, it's very close. But at the same time, what you guys as Australians, the objective, just
Go first,
Okay. Yes, we definitely do not want to be coming here to tell Sri Lanka how to do anything to do about climate change or climate justice. That is certainly not our objective. In fact, we wanted to come here to learn from you, and we hoped that this would be an exchange in that sense, because I would like to understand more about the situation here. But also to say we're not environmental scholars, we are performance scholars, so that our question is, what can performance do, which is your question as well. What does it do? What can you prove to me that it actually does? I can't prove anything, right? We all know that the kind of political efficacy of performance is impossible to kind of quantify in a solid sort of way. My belief, though, is that, and I was reading this, there was a great quote from, he was some kind of legal person in the American government, and he said, we've had the science, and he worked in economics, we've been doing, the science, the economics, the legalities for decades now, and it hasn't pushed us in the West to react quickly enough to respond to the problem of climate change. And we need something that, to use Eliasson's kind of verb, emotionalizes us, because otherwise it's just too easy for us to put those statistics over there and get on with our lives, and all the consumption in the West that kind of happens, and that facilitates that tap being continue to be turned on and flow freely from the corporations. And I do believe that every facet of society has to play a role, including the arts, however small that might be, in trying to change the zeitgeist, in trying to better educate people about issues, in trying to make us feel the urgency of the problem. And I think that that's what art can do that statistics kind of can't, because we know that we haven't reacted to statistics. And when I say we, I mean us in the West. I don't mean the global South. I mean very much kind of the countries that have done the pollution, done the industrialization on a kind of mass scale and first. So that's my answer.
And I'll try and answer a little bit about our intentions with the book. And I think broadly they're twofold. The first intention was to think through our own implication in these issues. So part of the book, I talked about, writing on stolen land. We didn't just write on stolen Indigenous land. We actually returned, in the course of writing this book, we returned to the place where I grew up, which is a particular rural community to live. We brought our family back to this rural community to live. And as we were coming back to this community, we were setting up a kind of small farm. We were growing crops. We had conversations about livestock, conversations about land management. And as part of that, what we started to be involved in were community conversations and also consultations with traditional owners. And by traditional owners, I mean local Indigenous groups. So for us, it's the Duro Wairau people of northeast Victoria. And in a sense, having conversations and seeking consultation from those people, inviting elders and uncles to our land and speaking through, rather than mowing our paddocks, what happens when we actually work with people to undertake cultural burning of our paddocks? How can we, on a small scale, start to revegetate soil that might have been depleted over time due to livestock farming? So in a very kind of individual way, we were thinking very deeply about us as performance scholars coming back to a particular place and thinking about the environment and our connection to it. And what would this do to our practice? All right? Always kind of circling back to, we make art again, how do we think about what we have just learnt here in this place? So in one way, very, very specific, very, very individual. The second intention of the book is broader, and who knows whether this intention will come to fruition or not. But we mount a very particular critique on certain models of Western theatrical training, certain models of Western thinking about theatre, and certain models of Western teaching around theatre. We make a very strong argument that the insular model that Lara spoke about, the idea that theatre training happens in black box theatres with no connection to the outside, with a series of typically white, able-bodied performers, creates, and responding to a history which is kind of deeply imbricated with a kind of colonial mindset, creates a particular type of theatre. A theatre that is actually kind of incapable of recognising its complicity in something as large as climate change, because it is always around the human figure, and it is always around insular rather than kind of exterior. So we say in the book, we need to change our thinking about theatre in a particular type of kind of Western form of theatre making. We need to critique the conservatoire model of Western performance training, by the way, which, you know, we have had some training in. You know, we've been in those institutions. We are not separate from this problem. We have both benefited from it, been part of it. We've seen the effects this has had to our colleagues, such as our colleagues. You know, Australia is a multicultural society with a homogenous theatre sector. It's a white theatre sector, right? And this is recognised as a TV. Yeah, and TV and film, you know, you name it. And part of this is around who is allowed into these conversations, who is allowed into the training. And not just that, it's also about how we train. How we train. How do we think about more than human actors in our training? What happens when we actually make a play that's not about humans at the centre? One of the great case studies we talk about in the book actually is, you know, happens as a guerrilla activity within a Western theatre training institution, but it's when a Brazilian dancer who was trained as a farmer, his parents were farmers, he comes in and makes a garden. The students who are dance students planted seeds. This is the first day of rehearsal. They plant seeds. They nurture a garden. The garden becomes the set. The whole dance kind of takes place around various seed cycles. Traditional owners are invited in, so it's about this place, these kind of biological agents all acting together, and it's a guerrilla activity kind of happening within the Western theatre. We say, you know, these are the types of things we need to be thinking about. How can we actually change how we make, how we teach, and how we think about theatre in a particular Western form of theatre training?
And can I just add to that? And we really wanted to come here specifically, and Salmi has been so generous in allowing and facilitating that to happen. And in some ways, it's counterintuitive because our critique is of Western theatre. It's not. I mean, our gut instinct was that it was not going to be the same, which is kind of why we wanted to come here. But also, we have been scholars for, I don't know, for more than a decade now, 15 years, 16 years, and we've always been speaking, even when we go to international conferences, we're always speaking to the same audiences. It's always the Western kind of audiences, and we're just over it. We just kind of live in these feedback loops, and we hadn't travelled for a while because we were being climate conscious and we were trying not to take aeroplanes, and we really, really wanted to get out of that feedback loop and be somewhere where we could learn something different and from different people. And yeah, those conferences get very, as Samia would know, you get the same audience a lot of the time, and it becomes, yeah, pointless in the end. Yeah, that's where we're at with that thinking. So, yeah.
Just a quick question around, I think you kind of touched on it, which is about artists building alliances with other professions and actors. So for instance, I know there's a salt conservation project happening in New South Wales. It's artists, farmers, and scientists. The farmers are given scientific knowledge by the scientists, and the artists come together to educate the local community about soil erosion and engage in project with local schools, so something like that I'm thinking of. So my question is, how do you build those alliances as performance artists? Because when we talk about theatre and artists, we just use that group of profession as a separate group by not engaging with other professions that are equally engaged in similar kinds of activism.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. The other thing is the political economy of art, which is the funding mechanisms for all that. So like a large installation like that requires serious funding. So it'll be good for you to talk about in which ways these artists are finding that funding. And for us, something for artists in Sri Lanka, what might be possible avenues for large-scale funding for projects like this?
Yeah. The artists. Yeah, thank you. That's such two great questions. In terms of bringing together those communities, what has been really exciting, because we moved from Melbourne to this regional area, is that we've been there almost 3 years now, and within that time, you kind of know everyone that's in the arts scene, and I'm also starting to know people that are in kind of, a lot of the conservationists as well, and there's heaps of opportunities. Suddenly I feel empowered because by shrinking the scale down to actually really do those kinds of things and bring people together, and there are galleries that are really doing that already, working with different local schools on projects. For example, there's the gallery, one of the galleries near us is doing a project all around frogs with primary school students, and they've got ecologists working with them, teaching them about the frogs, and then they paint them, and then they do an exhibition, and the parents all come, and then they have a discussion about the endangered frogs, and it's so great. It's doing all those things that you describe of drawing different groups together, and I have loved that about moving to a regional, because it feels too overwhelming to do that in the city, and I think there's so much opportunity because they're also in the countryside. They're looking for more cultural engagement, so they're like, if you propose something and you've got the time and energy to do it, people are like, yeah, sure, come in. That's if you want to do it. So that's really exciting. And then the second question was about the funding. I mean, it's definitely, I think Eliason is absolutely one of those big blockbuster kind of guys, right? And that's kind of also why I'm talking about someone like Tamopeo, who's not working with that kind of scale of funding. She was invited to go to COP, but she's growing in stature as an artist. She recently was at the Venice Biennale actually with her work, and so but it's been decades of work that has taken her to that level to be invited into those big sort of things. I mean, I'm thinking about those groups that go into the Tate Modern and they do the oil spills on the floors and those kind of guerrilla tactics as well, coming back to your question as well, of like being in spaces where you're not supposed to be, but also disrupting those fossil fuel funded institutions, right, and critiquing that, which has been really effective. We've also worked with a woman who's just recently been elected onto the Greens, our Greens party, one of our representatives for our Greens party, and she was an artist prior to that, being elected now. And one of her artworks, which we don't write about in the book, but one day I will write about it, is she created a map of all the Australian arts institutions and the ways in which they were fossil fuel funded or some kind of relationship to fossil fuel. It was, really, really great. But again, a very small scale thing that hardly anybody knows about the seas, but I think it will have a bigger life at some point. I hope it will. That's one of the privileges of having the job that we have, is because I feel like I get to go and make these artists a little bit more exposed to the world and to other people, to my students, and that feels like I'm doing a teeny tiny thing.
Generally, I know the issue of funding, I'm sure, is vexed here. I've spoken to colleagues who've spoken about how difficult it is, to generate funding, to even generate space, etc. Unfortunately, it is also incredibly difficult in Australia. Australia's a very wealthy country, but it devotes a minuscule amount to its arts sector, and actually it's shrunk so precipitously, so extraordinarily over the last 4 years. In particular, through COVID, our Conservative government used it as a way to shrink arts funding, and also to sort of create a very, very select group of major performing arts companies which may eat up most of the funding. So artists are struggling. I'm sure artists are struggling here too. And the issue of funding in Australia seems to have moved from a time of, yes, government funding, which was important, but also because of various other cost of living, prices, housing, all of these other factors. And also, in some ways, government policy and various other things leading to a weakening of arts communities, in a sense, of places where artists could gather, of modes where they could get together. The idea of the artist as a prime producer, the artist as the person who goes out and gets the funding, publicises the show, markets the show, performs the show, organises the reviews for the show, etc., etc. And it's been such a poisonous model for artists. And at the point where that last little bit of government funding is stripped away, we've seen many, many colleagues of ours have to give up making art. And it's been an extraordinarily sad thing to see. Lara was very, very heavily involved in a case that an artist, a friend and colleague of ours, made to the major arts awarding body a couple of years ago that stripped her of her funding erroneously, and she had to sue them in essence. And so Lara was a big part of the activism around that cause. But she won. Yeah, she did win. It is terribly difficult to find funding at the moment. For us, it is about using the institutions that we belong to as much as possible as ways and locations of making connections and of kind of supporting artists. Partly it's about writing about them. Often it's about collaboration for us too. So how can we use the support of the institution, even if the institution has money? This is also a vexed question now with universities, but that has been our role over the last little while, is also reaching out to our artist friends and saying, can we work together on something? Can we glean some money through the university? Depressing answer.
Yeah.
Shocking.
Any questions or ideas that you'd like to share with them? There's one question, maybe.
I just have one question in terms of as performance artists, because a lot of things that with climate change, there's also a lot of emotions, as Hélène mentioned, and with that being said, there's, I think, all over the world we're feeling all kinds of feelings, especially different kind of emotions associated with climate change. Have you all performed any of the in terms of climate emotions, have you all done anything? If you all have, then what were the observations that you all have made so far? Especially connecting with youth, especially connecting with our future generations. How do we relate in a manner that is also, that doesn't cause blame or that doesn't cause a lot of responsibility, but encourage to be proactive? Thank you.
Okay, sorry, I'm not sure if you're asking about things that we've done, artworks. Yeah, so the last work that we made, I wrote it. It was kind of a monologue piece, but Eddie had a cameo, and I wrote it while I was pregnant with my daughter, and because I was deeply immersed in this work, I was very worried about the future for her, and I performed it as a kind of solo performance art type monologue piece when she was 11 months old. So I breastfed her on stage, and Eddie came on with our son, who's a bit older, and they did a cameo. And part of the work was kind of a work of research about the gender kind of climate injustice around gender. But having her there on the stage was about changing the climate as well. And we also had in one of the performances, a room full of babies who were kind of gooing and guying and playing with things on the floor, and it was quite amazing to be on stage with that, and I think to be in the audience with that. It was a really beautiful atmosphere and something I hadn't really experienced in theatre before. But the idea of, in terms of connecting and being hopeful, was that I took the Julia Gillard. Do you know our former Prime Minister Julia Gillard made a misogyny speech where she called out the misogyny of the leader of the opposition? I took that and spliced it with pop songs, and to try and make it joyful and hopeful, I danced, and I'm a very, very bad dancer. Eddie can attest to that. I danced to all these pop song versions of the misogyny speech that I'd created in all the sort of different sections of the performance, and that was about trying to be hopeful and joyful that people do speak back to these what I see as interconnected problems of misogyny and climate change, again going up the tap. Anyway, that's it.
Lara is a bad dancer. I'm worse. She's terrible. One project I did want to mention, it's not one of ours, but I think it's an extraordinary project. It's a creative writing project, actually, so it's slightly outside of performance, but it was partly led by a really great friend of ours, the First Nations author whose name is Tony Birch. He's a Melbourne author. He has a really wonderful book, by the way, called Ghost River, and if anyone is ever interested in a kind of hidden and deep Indigenous history of Melbourne, it's a work of fiction, but it explores the idea of a river, the river that actually runs underneath the city of Melbourne. It's a very important spiritual story for the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, on which Melbourne is kind of currently situated. And Tony's a really great person. He was involved in a project called Weather Stations, which was working with young people from disadvantaged communities in Melbourne, so at the suburb of Footscray in Melbourne, Melbourne's west, and communities in Ireland, I believe, and also a community in Europe, I think Germany. And the conceit of this project was that young people, I think we're talking around about 10 years old, wrote about their feelings about the future, about climate change. And then they also connected with these other students, other young people from across the world. What Tony found from this project was that the stories created were extraordinarily imaginative, incredibly hopeful, but it also, not in an unrealistic sense, actually hopeful in a kind of practical, kind of problem-solving sense, that these young people not only knew what climate change was, not only understood the issues very deeply, but were very, very kind of creative about what they saw as the kind of future movements of the planet and how they were going to be involved in it. And I think that was a wonderful project around, harnessing creativity and also tapping into some of the different emotions that we might feel about climate change, other than despair. And of course we feel despair sometimes too. But the kind of creativity of these young people was, I think, a real marked kind of expression of that project, so the Weather Station project.
Yeah, that also reminds me, there's a thing called the Science Gallery, which is connected across different parts of the world. So there's one in Ireland and there's one in America. I can't remember where it is in America, but there's one also in South India. And I've been working with the one in Melbourne, and they've been doing a big exchange with the one in South India. It's working with young people to do, it's called Hacking the Anthropocene is the project. It's partly in person and it's online, but it might be something that's worth looking into as a kind of, if you have students or young people who are interested in getting involved in that project, I think it would be very possible from here, because I don't think it's very far, and it's a really cool, amazing project where young people are kind of taking the reins of what they want to see, what kind of change they want to see happening, and using creativity and happening both in this digital, what do they call it, like a pluriverse, is that what it's called? A pluriverse, and digital worlds that they're creating, but they're also spending months doing these kind of in-person workshops as well. So.
Hi, thank you very much firstly, but I also just wanted to maybe hear you talk a little bit about ethics maybe in terms of practice, and I'm asking it as somebody who has worked as a performer and worked in community kind of storytelling contexts. So I also believe that ethics works in conversations, in relationships, in very creative and dynamic ways. So I just am curious about, because I'm hearing it in the living and the choices made for a particular lived experience also as academics. So I just would like to hear you talk about it, and also how it extends to the works of performers in relation to land. And they're working with these kind of elemental forces. I love the compost concept, but the elements are sort of elicited into performance spaces and structures, and I don't know if, to what extent hierarchies are being reinstated because of that. So yeah, in one way your own practice, but also what you've observed and seen of performers working with land, with ice.
Yeah. That's a really lovely question. It's actually at the centre of the book, I would suggest. It's been an incredibly important project of us to think about, yes, what relationship do the artists bring, what ethical relationships do they bring to their work, but I think for us, really importantly, how do we not form, again, as kind of settler scholars, how do we not form an extractive relationship with the artists that we're writing about, writing with, however it is. Part of that for us has been to acknowledge at the start of the book our own kind of complicity in hierarchies of power. So I don't think that we pretend that they don't exist, and just by saying that we're on board for a conversation, it doesn't take away historical legacies, doesn't take away our own white privilege. But I think we make the very strong point in that we try to work with the scholarly texts as well as the artists as much as possible in a non-extractive way, in the sense that we try to form relationships, acknowledge relationships. We try to pay very deep attention to citation, because we understand in particular when we're working with Indigenous knowledges from Australia, but also acknowledgement from female scholars around the world who've been writing about ecology for a long time and simply do not get the credit. So for us it felt, don't get any credit, right? And so for us it felt like an extremely hollow idea for us to write a book about environmental connection and not to acknowledge that the First Nations people of Australia had this knowledge and were deeply involved with it for millennia. And again, it was not cited ever, right? So scholars in Australia, there are many typical names out there who write about environment and performance and talk about interconnection, network performance, etc., etc. We found that would be a fallacy. If we were to not pay attention to some of those Indigenous knowledges, it would be a real betrayal. And so we put it right up front and we say, look, we will work with these knowledges, work with, not take, and try to actually cite, form relationships. So that sometimes means co-authorship. More often it means discussion and asking permission, consulting with elders as needed. But also a lot of the authors and artists we're working with, in particular the First Nations people of Australia, are elders themselves, and so consulting with them about how do they like to be referred to, are we able to use their work, sharing our work with them, so there's a feedback loop around our work, changing things as we go along as well, offering co-authorship, but also remembering that we don't want to always put it on the First Nations people to speak in relation to climate, in actual fact, and speak in these terms. So also saying we're willing to do work here, and we want to make it, we want to act respectfully out of your wishes. And so there's some of the processes that we've been through. And we try to actually extend these processes to our relationships with other artists. And again, that's meant contacting artists, talking to them, working with them. Sometimes it's meant, as with Lara's work, so Lara has collaborated now a bunch of times with Tait on various different projects. So occasionally we've written about Tait, occasionally Lara writes.
Trying to reciprocate.
Right, there's a reciprocal kind of relationship. And again, we're drawing on scholars like Dwayne Donald. In Australia, there are important scholars, Tony, our colleague who I mentioned a while back, who really make the point that if settler and Indigenous relations are going to continue, there needs to be a set of rules, there needs to be a set of boundaries, there needs to be a kind of ethical framework for that to move forward, but that it's important we try to move forward. And so we have said, we're risking, of course, something here. The risk is not as great as the risk of extraction. The risk of extraction is always greater. Colonial extraction is always greater. However, we also are risking our little bit here by trying to form relationships, by trying to kind of move forward in a reciprocal way. And if we get it wrong, which we may, of course we might, then it's about, okay, what next? What moving forward? How can we do? What can we do? What sort of things can we work on together? And so, yeah, it's laid out in, I suppose, the first sort of part of this book. We spent a lot of time talking about those relationships and how we've set them up. The final thing to say is we also try to apply a certain amount of ethics to the non-human elements, which gets to your thing about moving ice out of Greenland, right, into Copenhagen. What does that mean? What does it actually do to the ecosystem? And so part of our conversation in this work is also about where have these more than human elements come from? In a sense, where do they belong? And one locus we use, which is kind of a metaphor, but it's also literally standing outside of our kitchen window, is a peppermint tree. It's a peppermint tree, it's called the Agonis flexiosa. Now the place where we live is called Wurji, and in Duderoa language, Wurji means peppermint tree. So it makes sense, there's a peppermint tree outside our kitchen window. This peppermint tree, the Agonis flexiosa, actually originates in Western Australia, 3,000 kilometres away. The settler people who've lived in our house previously have thought they were paying respect. We think, have thought they were paying respect by planting this tree. They bought it at a nursery, that seed has travelled 3,000 kilometres, a plant has been raised, but now we have this tree standing in front of us. And this tree serves for us as this kind of locus in the book where we come back to the peppermint tree. What happens when a natural actor is out of place in its environment? Like we are out of place on stolen land writing this book. How can we think through the disconnection that happened where this peppermint tree has ended up here, rather than the actual Wurji, the actual peppermint tree which we have growing in our paddock. And so thinking through these disconnections and where we get it wrong, I think is an important part of the book too.
I'll just add to that because I'm learning, especially from Salmia's beautiful wife, how much Sri Lankan women love to feed children and other people. And my Sri Lankan mother is also a force feeder. And one of our practices, which comes to this relationship between the land and our building, our ethics and our relationships, is that we are beekeepers. We're not very good at it, but we are learning to be beekeepers, and so we try to give honey to all of our artists and scholars and people that we work with. We feed them the labour of the love that we have for our bees, and try to build that into part of our ethics of connecting them to our country and the flowers and the pollination that happens on our property, and kind of drawing them into to our kind of our gratefulness for their time and thoughts and expertise.
Thank you. Really lovely question.
Right. I think it's nearly 5:30 now. Sure. Yes, 5:34. If you don't have any questions or ideas to share, we can actually wind up this session and have a cup of tea and possibly a coffee with a couple of biscuits just to wind up this session nicely. And thank you very much. And again, first and foremost, I would like to thank Dr. Lara and Professor Lara. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on your projects and as well as your upcoming